Monica Gattinger est la directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et la politique publique de l'Université d'Ottawa et professeure agrégée à l'École d'études politiques de l'Université d'Ottawa et aussi présidente du projet d'Énergie positive. She's one of the university's star researchers, an expert on public confidence in energy decision-making, and again, a leading voice in this field. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you.
Peut-être on va passer à Monica. D'après vous, est-ce que les gouvernements, à date, est-ce qu'ils ont fait assez pour créer un environnement d'éducation, de compréhension pour les citoyennes et de vraiment expliquer ce qu'on devrait faire pour atteindre ce sommet d'une quelque chose qui nous mène vers un environnement d'une green society, si on pourrait dire?
Réponse courte, non. Merci, Monsieur le Chancelier, pour l'opportunité de participer à ce débat. C'est vraiment un énorme honneur, un énorme plaisir. Je vais présenter certaines de mes recherches. Je pilote un projet à l'Université d'Ottawa qui est basé ici, mais qui est un projet pan-canadien qui porte sur l'acceptabilité sociale dans le domaine de l'énergie. Je vais passer en anglais puisqu'il y a plusieurs de nos panélistes qui ne comprennent pas vraiment le français. Mais si jamais il y a des questions que vous voulez me poser en français, il me ferait énorme plaisir de vous répondre dans la langue de votre choix. So in response to your question, have governments been doing enough to educate the public? And based on the research that we've been undertaking over the last 3 years now, research and engagement, actually substantial engagement, across a variety of leaders in the energy sector, energy companies, policymakers, regulators, Indigenous leaders, leaders from ENGOs, municipalities, and the like. One of the things that I'd like to take issue a little bit with in the question that was posed is, have governments been doing enough to educate the public? And I think what our research really underscores is a different question, which is, have governments been doing enough to listen to the public, to listen to what people are saying around transition? Energy policy, and that's my background for the last 20 years, been studying energy policy and regulation here in the Canadian context, North American context as well. It's an increasingly complex area of public policy with really four core imperatives. And in no particular order, market imperatives, right, ensuring that we've got energy markets that are functioning in a competitive fashion, to Annette's points a moment ago. Environmental imperatives, and yes, that's part of what brings us here today, climate, but also other environmental impacts. There's no silver bullet when it comes to energy. Any energy source has environmental impacts, which I think is something we always need to bear in mind. And security imperatives as well, and that can be, reliability of energy supply, energy security globally as well. And those imperatives increasingly have been joined by a fourth imperative. En français, on dirait l'acceptabilité sociale. In English, social acceptance and support for energy. And the research that we've been undertaking, which is really focusing in on strengthening public confidence in energy decision-making, in case folks haven't noticed over the last number of years, there is increasing contentiousness around energy decision-making in this country, whether it's for individual energy projects or energy policy and regulation more broadly. We've undertaken very substantial research at the community level, working with communities who have experienced, so to say, energy project decision-making processes in their locales. And this is everything from pipelines to windmills to electricity transmission infrastructure to large-scale hydro. And one of the things that research underscores, and it's extremely important for this debate today, is that when we see opposition at the local level, in many instances, it's actually not about the climate. That's important, right? It's often about local environmental impacts. It's about local economic impacts. It's about other sorts of considerations that maybe not be the ones we think of first when we're having discussions and debates around climate. And we looked at energy projects where things actually went very well as well. We looked at a lot that were contentious. One of the things, and this comes back to the question that was asked, is there's often a knee-jerk reaction, a presumption, whether it's on the part of energy proponents or folks who are interested in climate and reducing GHG emissions, that, well, if only people understood, if only they understood the importance of this project, they would support it. And our research really underscores that there are limits to that energy literacy thesis or project literacy thesis, that in some instances, what we're seeing is actually different values and different worldviews. And so I take everything that all the panelists have said, but I think the research that we've undertaken really points to, we have to look carefully at the how of all of this, and do we have Canadians on board? Because if we are going to be moving aggressively towards a much lower carbon intensity energy system, that, my friends, is going to mean building a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think it's far from a foregone conclusion that local communities will support that. Now, again, I'm not up here to be putting forward a negative perspective, not at all. What I'm trying to bring forward, though, is we have to think about those elements and dimensions of this piece moving forward,
I think,
too.
Again, we'll come back to that as well, because I think that will be somewhat of a recurring theme as to the speed with which and the reality check needed to have some level of transformation. We talk about this. I think that generally people might have a different perspective as to the speed with which some of this transformation can occur, as to the sacrifices needed to effect the transformation, as to who is a winner and who's a loser in that transformation process, as to what that does to the competitive environment. But what are the tools that governments need to consider when they go through that? So, is it sensible to say, I'm going to take out a big, thick marker and write the words carbon tax as a starting point? What are the different subtleties? We talk about a price on carbon. We talk about market-based measures in the aviation industry. As some folks might know, there was an agreement amongst the 200-plus governments around the world through ICAO to come up with a mechanism that can create some level of consensus as to how a market-based measure could be introduced. That's relatively fair. Of course, it's not fair to everyone. Is it realistic to think that carbon tax, as the federal government, for example, has been suggesting, is a one-size-fits-all type of approach that makes sense? So, Monica, on the question of the different tools at play on the regulatory mechanisms?
Well, I think all of the above is probably the trite answer. And I take Sephora's point about policies providing certainty. One of the things, though, that I think has changed in the current context, there's much more agreement and widespread, I'd say, support now for the need to move on climate. There's sort of less disagreement and an opposition around that issue, which means then that we're actually in the position of moving from talking about the what to talking about the how. And I don't think we've got a very good grasp on the how. And so I don't disagree that policies provide certainty. Policy reversals, though, that provides chaos and real substantial challenges in terms of investment, regulatory predictability, policy predictability, not only for companies, but also for individual citizens as well. So I think, when it comes to thinking about the tools, one of the tools that we're beginning to turn our mind to is, what is the energy transition decision-making system? We have a sense of what the energy decision-making system is. Even that, as we all know, is extraordinarily complex. But what does the energy transition decision-making system look like? Who are the different players in that system? What are their respective roles? And increasingly, there's a role clearly, for Indigenous governments, for municipal governments. But how are we going to pull all of this together in a way that not only is aligned and moves us forward, but also doesn't leave the system vulnerable to policy reversals. At the end of the day, as we know, to Stuart's point earlier, we do live in a democracy with all of its wonderful qualities, but also some of its challenging qualities in terms of short-term political imperatives, sometimes carrying the day over longer-term, public interests. So thinking through what are our institutional tools for moving forward on transition and trying to ensure that we're actually really well developed on the capacity front, the institutional capacity for the how. That's going to be extraordinarily important when it comes to getting to that policy certainty that Sapporo was mentioning.
I want to cover a theme around international and global realities. I touched on the aviation industry, which, as I mentioned, has got this agreement, CORSIA, which is an agreement that was signed between the ICAO states, but it exists in many other industries as well. As a global dynamic, how do you, let's say you manage to control supply here, but as a result of you controlling supply here, by definition, it's created opportunities for someone in some other country, in whatever the industry is. I'm not only referring to the oil and gas business, but in whatever industry it is that can manage to crank up supply, which not only puts back into the environment the emissions that you've just helped take out, but of course also then creates a fairly unbalanced economic outcome. How do you deal with that longer term? Do you look at industry-specific solutions where industries globally are asked through their various associations? Not every industry has something equivalent to an ICAO that can regroup countries together. And the United Nations certainly has never been very good at coming to agreements on anything. So how do you do that in different industries? And secondly, who gets to decide if there are winners and losers between countries, and winners and losers between industries? This industry gets to win, and this industry is sacrificed. Somebody will tell you that the farming industry, that one of the biggest pollutants out there are livestock, the existence of livestock, and so should we eliminate farming as a farming of cattle as an industry completely? Who gets to decide on that from that perspective?
The question that you pose, I think, really comes back to this idea of what is the energy transition decision-making system? Who decides? And to your question earlier, one of the things that I think would concern me is if we centralize too much of that decision-making. If there's one thing that we have learned about governments is that they're not necessarily good at picking winners.
No, that's the point. Yeah.
I've also heard that losers are good at picking governments, but that maybe is another, may or may not be empirically accurate, but I think it's really important, though, that we put in place the policy and regulatory frameworks that incentivize movement in the right direction. That's got to be key. And when it comes to decision-making as well, again, one of the things that we've seen increasingly in our work is, two social and value changes that are making decision-making, certainly in energy, but definitely in many areas of public policy, increasingly complex, in addition to all the complexities we're talking about here as well. And that's, one, lower levels of public trust in governments, in industry, in regulators, in the media, almost you name it, but definitely lower levels of public trust. At the same time that we see rising interest and expectations that citizens have to be involved in decisions that affect them. That means that decision-making, increasingly, we've seen this in our energy work, needs to be a shared, decentralized decision-making system, which adds another level of complexity to this. But in the absence of thinking through how we can do this in a way that garners that social acceptance and support, we're much more likely to see substantial opposition to centralized decision-making. It might take more time. And that, I think, is a worry for those who would like to see us move at a very aggressive, rapid pace.
Yeah. And it is somewhat counterintuitive because you heard the earlier comment about the the ultimate centralized organization ought to be something like a United Nations that says, we can somehow corral all of the nations of the planet to decide. Of course, we know that doesn't work, but they try for that, and they try repeatedly. And then, central governments try to impose it in terms of national objectives. And I take your point. I think that it is a tall objective. While I 100% agree that the right way to do it is to decentralize it and to have pockets of it, I think that is something that governments would have a tough time wrapping their minds around as
Oh, absolutely agreed. Governments have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. Regulators have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. Industry has a hard time wrapping their mind around it. But those who are not wrapping their mind around it are having a hard time getting things
to
done.
the next level.
Right? I mean, so you look at any of the work that we've done with Indigenous communities, what is it that every Indigenous leader says when it comes to thinking through energy project decision-making that involves them? Nothing about us without us, right? Start by building the relationship. This is not a centralized decision-making system, and we're seeing that in municipalities, municipalities as well.
Sir? Please identify yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Ken Johnson. I'm an adjunct professor at Ottawa U, and I've had an interest in climate for a long time. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the wide variety of interesting thoughts and comments from the panel. I haven't seen quite the debate I was hoping, but that's okay. 2 points I'd like you to address a little bit more. First of all, the idea of procurement, I think, is very important. I know in places like China they use it extensively. However, I'm very concerned with the way the keenness with which the federal government has developing new trade deals, that often the trade deals are a huge impediment to actually government procurement and choosing how they procure things. I'd like anyone that might want to address that a bit more. The other thing is, it's extremely clear, as has been mentioned but not spent a lot of time on, that we simply have to change to reducing carbon in Canada, and it's more than evident probably to everyone in the room that we have to stop increasing the number of fossil fuels coming out of Alberta. There's no other way that we will possibly meet targets. Our carbon footprint is still going up. We haven't even, and I think that's the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed much more seriously. And I'd appreciate comments on any of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Monica, and then after that, Stuart.
Sure. So in response to the question, I'm going to say something you probably aren't going to like very much, and folks in this room might not like very much. If we were in Alberta, folks there would say the elephant in the room is consumption, right? So 80% of the GHG emissions from a barrel of oil are released when it's consumed. So I think we also need to be looking at, the broader picture. Yes, having that discussion and the conversation and debate around expansion of fossil fuel production, but also around the consumption of fossil fuels, and what are we going to do in terms of driving down consumption.
But that's kind of like saying we're going to continue to produce asbestos, and someone, as long as someone else can decide whether they want to use it.
No, I don't know. I wouldn't agree. I wouldn't agree with that. I think what I'm putting on the table at this point is there is a tendency in this country, I have found in my research, to narrow the debate quite substantially onto upstream production, which, yes, there needs to be a focus on looking at those issues. But when it comes to GHG emissions, at the end of the day, it's emissions. It's emissions. And emissions are produced from a variety of different activities.
The majority of ours come from heavy industry. The majority of our emissions in this country come from heavy industry, which is why.
Okay, but again, that's
growth in emissions comes from heavy
but again,
industry, which is why the focus has been there.
But it's consumption, right? And how do we drive down the emissions intensity of consumption, as well as, right? It's an all of the above, and that's what I'm trying to put on the table.
You've created here a
That's what I was looking
CNN.
for, was a little debate. Thank you.
You did it.
CNN type of a debate. So I want
Okay, I'm Susan Tosh. I'm the director of the School of Nutrition Sciences, and I agree with John that we need another conversation on adaptation. I'm particularly interested in food security and how we are going to maintain that, because that is a huge elephant in the room. But anyway, it's outside the scope of today's talk, and my question is, why is it acceptable that we could put in a carbon tax, but it's not acceptable to remove the subsidies or change the subsidies to subsidizing something else? Why is that not a viable policy?
I think, Annette, why don't you start? I think you're suggesting that it could be a viable policy, that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to. Monica?
Well, now that Stuart has opened the door to going back to previous questions, I want to pick up on this question about security, because I think it's extremely important. And it relates to adaptation to some extent, but the security piece, energy security in this country predominantly has been about we have affordable, reliable energy. One of the reasons we have affordable, reliable energy is because we have a multi-fuel system, right? So we have energy coming from electricity, from oil, from gas, variety of different sectors. As we move towards greater electrification of the system, if that is one of the pathways towards decreasing the carbon intensity of our systems, I think we're going to need to be looking at security and resilience much more carefully. Was anybody here during the ice storm? Mm-hmm. Was anybody here during the blackout? Imagine if during that period of time you actually couldn't drive your car, or you couldn't do a whole host of things that require energy, because a good deal of our energy in the future could be coming from electricity. So this question of security begins to become extraordinarily important. And again, not a reason not to move in that direction, but definitely another thing that underpins the importance of thinking about the how. As we move forward, how do we move forward in a way that also ensures that we've got security of energy supply, affordability of energy supply, resilient systems in the context of, as we know, much more frequent severe climate events, which have a way of cutting out, notably, electricity systems.
And I think that's a great example. And can you imagine if Puerto Rico had microgrids along with a decentralized, a much more decentralized system? There would be places on that island that there would be electricity. And one of the problems with these great big grids is that if it goes down, it is disastrous. And so I think the decentralization of energy will bring security to the systems, and I see that.
We've had an amazing panel. I have to say, this is it stimulates a tremendous amount of thought. I mean, we have not solved the issue here this afternoon, but I can tell you one thing is that certainly you've planted a lot of food for thought for lots and lots and lots of people here. So please join me in thanking Annette Verschuren. Sephora Berman, Monica Gattinger, and Stuart LG. I think this was fantastic fun. Thank you very, very, very much. You guys were awesome. Really first rate. Thank you.